Good morning, welcome, greetings, welcome to our fifth session on What History Class Left Out, African History from 711 to 1896. We have a lot to talk about today. We're going to spend a lot of time in Central Africa. We're going to spend time in the diaspora, particularly in the Americas, and we will talk about the impact of the European-initiated slave trade during the 16th and between the 16th and 18th centuries today. So that'll be our discussion. We'll start, as always, with a quick review of what we went over last week. Then we'll jump into that. We'll take a quick break in the middle, Q&A, and then we will, of course, end with our open discussion and Q&A. All right, so what we'll talk about today. What was going on in Central Africa in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries? That will be the first part of our discussion today. We'll focus in the area primarily around Angola, what's now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as Zambia. So that'll kind of be the region that we'll dissect today. Then we'll talk about the European-initiated slave trade and its effects primarily on this region as well as West Africa. And I know we've begun touching on that over the past couple of weeks at various points, but we're going to really dig at it today. And then we're going to talk about the characteristics of liberated African communities in the Americas. So we're going to look at migration and state building and nation building in Central Africa during this time. And then we'll see Africans doing the same type of migration and nation building in the Americas when they were able to escape enslavement and form their own communities. We'll look at places like Mexico, Brazil, and a couple of other spots today, and you'll be able to see the similarities that we've, briefly mentioned in previous sessions. Like last week when we talked about Queen Mothers and how that institution translated in the Americas and transferred to the Americas when Africans were able to create their own political systems as they escaped enslavement. So this is what we'll be talking about this week. We've been, again, making our way counterclockwise throughout Africa during this time period. We started in North Africa, then we moved into Northwest Africa. Then last week, we spent a lot of time talking about the Ashanti Empire, the Kingdom of Dahomey, the Kingdom of Benin. Then we actually we moved all the way into the Kingdom of Baganda when we were talking about the institution of the Queen Mother. Today's course is going to be centered right in the middle of Africa, close actually to the south. South Central Africa, I guess that's what we could call it. We could call it South Central Africa. So we're going to be talking about the Luba Kingdom, a little bit on the Lunda Kingdom, and we will be talking about the Kingdom of Congo. Now, as I mentioned, earlier in this semester, when we began the class, I said as much as possible, I like to focus on everyday people and kind of interrupt a little bit our understanding that history is only the history of these great empires and kingdoms. I try to do that as much as possible, but to be quite honest, the evidence that we get from this time period mostly comes as a result of royal record keeping and the interactions between African royalty and Arab writers, or African royalty and their representatives and European writers. So you get a more royal-centric view of the history. The voices of everyday people are often lost during the further we go up in history, the more we will get the voices of non-royal people, working class people. But we have to go with what we have. And then we can use other forms of evidence to kind of fill in those gaps about what everyday people were doing. And even in the royal chronicles, whether it's oral history or written history, we can still see glimpses of the life of everyday people. So I always like to caveat with that, because although we're focused on these kingdoms and empires, I don't want us to lose sight of the everyday working people that made up these empires, that were often exploited by these empires in some instances. So that's very important for us to point out, because most of us on this call are not royalty. I mean, unless there's folks in here that have some hidden wealth somewhere and they're actually princes or princesses in disguise. Most of us are everyday people, and our ancestors were everyday people. So important to point that out. So today, let's go back a little bit. Since we're talking about Central Africa, we actually need to go back into our course that we had all the way back in August and September. African History Part 1, when we went from 10,000 BCE up to 711. And in that course, we had an entire session dedicated to the Bantu migrations, actually, Bantu migrations, because it's not just one continuous migration. We talked about how somewhere around what's now modern-day Nigeria and modern-day Cameroon, we see the beginnings of Bantu culture. And in the, let's say, around 3000 BC is when they say it begins, but this movement of people throughout Central Africa, ultimately culminating in East Africa and in Southern Africa, goes throughout this period of time. And the period that we're going to talk is after this, and we're going to see the consolidation of kingdoms with this Bantu base. The Bantu were able to expand throughout this region through their mastery of iron technology, their mastery of diplomacy, because when the Bantu interact with other folks that are already in the region, whether they're the Twa people, who the Europeans derogatorily call pygmies, the people that are of short stature and they live throughout Central and East Africa, Southern Africa, we see the Bantu interact with the Twa in a very diplomatic manner for the most part. So we talk about diplomacy, we talk about scientific advancement of the Bantu, which is the introduction of iron technology throughout much of this region as a result of the Bantu migration. So the Bantus are able to move because they've mastered iron. They're making better tools, they're making better hunting implements, better farm tools, and they're using, and better weapons to spread and to grow, to take their language, their philosophy throughout this really almost a half of Africa's landmass. We have Bantu people, Bantu languages, Bantu philosophy being spread. So very important that was occurring. So after folks are moving, and the migration doesn't end at this time. This is just where most people get settled, but even in this, people are still moving around. Because even today, this portion of Africa is not as densely populated as you would think. This is a huge landmass. So there's a lot of place for people to move around, which is actually good for what we'll talk about today as kingdoms arose and fell, because people were able to set up new political systems without the extreme conflict that you see in more congested areas. Because when people got fed up with the ruling class, they would just move. Now it might take you a little more time to set up, to reestablish yourself, to clear forests, to plant, for farming, for different things, but it allowed a safety valve of sorts for pressure, for societal pressure. If you got fed up enough with the king or the queen or the ruling class, folks would move. Or if there were competition among members of the ruling class and they didn't want to necessarily go to an extreme civil war, folks would migrate and set up other kingdoms. So we see this a lot during the time period that we'll be talking about today, the 1500s, the 1600s, and the 1700s. So our evidence for this time period: written record, Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch. And this is our evidence for what was going on in Central Africa as well as what was going on in the Americas during this time period that we'll be discussing today. Oral history, very important in Central Africa. And we'll talk about one of the most ingenious forms of oral record keeping among the Luba kingdom that we'll spend a lot of time talking about today. And of course, archaeology. Archaeology plays a major role in helping us reconstruct the history of this time period. Now, more archaeology does need to be done in Central and South Central Africa. A lot more needs to be done. And it's not as easy as the archaeology that you will find in places like Northeast Africa, just because of climate conditions and so on and so forth. But it's possible, and more work needs to be done. So the more archaeological work we do, the clearer our picture of the history during that time. But these are our main sources of primary evidence for the history that we'll talk about today. If you're following along in the recommended book, History of Africa, the 4th edition by Kevin Shillington, this information is in chapter 9. He talks about this in chapter 9. So again, this is the book that I always recommend to read alongside this class as well as part 1 of this course, because it's a beautifully illustrated textbook. It has a lot of information and you'll learn a lot. So I always recommend Shillington's text. So here's what we're talking about today. Here's the area that we're discussing. The Luba Kingdom. The Luba Kingdom is there in what's now the Katanga region of the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the wealthiest regions on the planet Earth in terms of mineral wealth. If you were to look at the world like a monopoly board, Congo would be Boardwalk. I think that's the most expensive. I haven't played Monopoly a while, but I think it's Boardwalk. Boardwalk, right. So Congo has everything. Congo has diamonds, Congo has gold, Congo has, in particular for our modern society, coltan and cobalt. These are the things that are making this conversation that we're having possible. That's being put into the microchips and the batteries and all these things that we're using to make our internet world work. You can find all of that in the Congo. And it's been a tremendously valuable place even back there. Because this whole corridor of Africa that you see, the things that you see in purple, the lines you see, we can call this the copper belt of Africa, the copper belt. Copper is incredibly valuable in this region of Africa, and it's valuable, and this is kind of an oxymoron. It usually doesn't work this way, but it becomes valuable because of its abundance. And now it's being able to, copper is traded all throughout this region and even exported to other parts of the world. This is the copper belt of Africa. What gold is in West Africa, like we've talked about with Mali and Songhai and Ghana and their control of the gold trade, copper was in this part of Central Africa, in South Central Africa. So north, gold, copper in this region. So copper and iron are the main drivers of political expansion and political and economic development in this region. So you see a region connected by trade, and copper plays a major role as currency in trade. This is what the money looked like back in the day. These copper, what they call crossettes or crossettes, these crosses made out of copper. Some were big, some were small, and they were used to denote wealth. So if you were, engaged in the market, you might use those little ones to buy fruit, to buy salted fish, which was also a major commodity in the region. As you can see, this region is littered with rivers and lakes. So people salted fish. That salting of fish and the techniques for drying and preserving fish allowed for populations to grow. You had a stable source of protein. The iron tools that were created were used to clear farmland. And actually in this region, when you start to get south of the Congo rainforest, you enter almost a mirror version of what you see in the north. So if we go back to this slide, you see the route taken by the Congo migrations. It cuts through the Congo rainforest and it cuts over, or they bypass the Congo rainforest altogether and go in that southeasterly direction. Those lines represent very fertile areas of grassland that border the rainforest. So a lot of the communities were set up to exploit the farmland, the very rich soil, right at the border of the rainforest. And then the rainforest is used for hunting. The rainforest is used to collect precious goods, animal goods, and other things. But primarily speaking, it's the grasslands on the periphery of the rainforest that provided the basis for these large kingdoms to emerge. So folks are taking advantage of the rivers, they're taking advantage of the fertile soil, and they're building kingdoms. And they're also, again, of course, taking advantage of the mineral wealth in this region, the deposits of iron ore, the deposits of copper, and so on and so forth. So they're setting up, they're building nations. And the first one that is major in this region is the Luba Kingdom. A lot of oral history with the Luba Kingdom that we can dissect, and a lot of archaeological history that has been done. So Luba emerges somewhere between the 14th century and the 15th century. Now, the oral history can only take us back so far, and it's also, again, like we see with a lot of oral epics in Africa, mixed with fantastical elements. So you have to kind of read it with that in mind, that part of this is historical, that we can corroborate with the archaeological evidence, but we don't have a lot of written evidence for this time because there's no one visiting the Luba Kingdom in the 1400s and the 1500s that can write about what's going on. So we have to rely on the oral history. And oral history talks about this battle between two kings. One king by the name of Nkogolo, and another by the name of Ilunga. Ilunga and Nkogolo are battling. And one of the things that sparks off this battle is this question of divine kingship, which would go on to define the Luba Kingdom. Ilunga comes to the kingdom of Nkongolo, and he's confused because Nkongolo eats among his subjects. Ilunga says, wait a minute, you're a king. your subjects should never see you eat. They should never see you do anything human. And this is something that we see actually throughout many different parts of Africa. This semi-divine status of the king. The king is not supposed to walk on the ground. The king is not supposed to be seen eating. The king often comes in public in a veil. You don't look directly at the king because the king represents the ancestors and represents the spiritual elements that are now in the world. So the king's job is to make sure that the ancestors are appeased so that things go right. We don't have drought. We don't have incessant warfare. We don't have this imbalance. We can actually see this even as far back as ancient Egypt, because that was the role of the pharaoh. The pharaoh's job was to be that conduit. So the same thing here in Central Africa. The sacredness of the king called the Mulopwe. Mulopwe. That's the name of the divine kingdom, Mulopwe. And underneath the king are other Mulopwes, other lesser kings that, as the empire of Luba expanded, they brought kings into it. And those kings' jobs were to collect tribute to give to the main Mulopwe at the capital. As this kingdom expanded through its iron technology, through its control of the copper trade, through its advanced farming, and new people got in, we see a diversification of the economy. We see folks engaged in trade. So there's people that are specialized just in trade. The mining operations, the folks that are mining the copper and the iron ore, the metalworking, the smithing, the forging of new tools and weapons, hunting, fishing, farming. This is what the everyday folks are doing. And all of their goods, all of their surplus of everything that's happening is going up to the king. So the regional kings, they get their cut and they make sure that they don't even take a cut. Their job is to get all this tribute and get it to the king in the capital. And then the king redisperses these goods to the rest of the kingdom. So it's a cyclical process. The king gets these tributes. The king then redisperses gifts among his regional governors, the lowercase Mulopwe. They are the ones that get it, and then it goes to, so this is the cycle. And it works well, and the tribute is paid, because if the tribute is not paid, the king will then tell his subordinates, go oppress this village and make sure that they pay the tribute. But then the subordinates expect from the king payment in return. And if things don't work out, if something is broken in this process, oftentimes the king would be overthrown. The king would be asked to step down. Or if there's some type of imbalance in society, if there's a drought, or if there's something that spiritually you're responsible for, then you'd be in trouble as well. So the everyday people are living in almost a theocracy, because they aren't necessarily often controlled with the harsh hand of military policing. So it's not like if you don't pay, that is the ultimate thing that will happen. But that's not mostly what folks are afraid of. They pay the tribute because they see themselves as part of a continuum, a spiritual continuum. I pay tribute to the king because the king represents the ancestors and will be blessed by giving tribute to the king. I mean, it's no different than the people that go to the mega churches and pay their pastor, they're tied to the pastor, because they believe if I tie it to the church, then I'll get blessings to come back to me. This is really, it's no different. It's just in a political system instead of a purely spiritual system. But that's what was happening. As this empire expanded, these trade networks, this is a vast area, and this is an empire of 1 million people. So this is not a small place. This is not some small little nation. This is a million people are involved in this extensive network that's being built up over the centuries, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. And through this, we see artists that are employed by the state, craftsmen, craftswomen. And one of the motifs that we see in Luba art is the stool. Now, we talked about the importance of the stool in Ghana, the golden stool, and the other stools that represent the Ashanti Empire and the Ashanti rulership. Well, among the Luba, they have a stool as well. And often these stools were decorated with motifs of African women. So actually, the king, nobody sits on these stools. They're ceremonial, so you don't actually sit on them. But what they represent women holding up the kingdom. Because at its very earliest, the Luba kingdom was a matrilineal society, meaning just like in other parts of Africa, you were able to be royal based off of your relationship through your mother to the royal family. not through your father. It turns patrilineal later on, but at the beginning it's matrilineal. And we see this still represented in the art, because what the artist is saying is that women uphold the kingdom. And it's even part of the Luba spiritual practices and spiritual philosophy that men and women each play their own role in society. And women are the progenitors of life and the sustainers of life. And they sustain this kingdom through their farming, even as well. Because if you know anything about farming in Africa, most of the farm work is actually done by women. So when we talk about African farmers and control of land and all these things, that actual labor, most of it is done by women. So they made it a point to show this. Now, I want to stop here, not stop, but I want to pivot to talk about this artwork and to talk about the archaeology that we have from the Luba Kingdom. So again, archaeology has brought up things like the currency that was actually used, how copper was smelted and turned into these crocettes, and this was the currency that was traded throughout this extensive region. That again goes from eastern Angola throughout Congo into Zambia and even further parts into East Africa. So we have this in the archaeological record. We have studies that provide us with the methods to reconstruct African history. Again, I like to mention these things because in this class, I don't want you to think that we can only reconstruct history through written record or the oral record. We have so many techniques now that allow us to really get into what was going on in Africa. And some of these techniques might surprise you. This recent article that came out in 2019, I always get this word mixed up. Provencing. See, it takes me a minute to say it. I have a lisp, so it's kind of hard sometimes with some of these words. Provencing Central Africa copper crocettes, a first chemical and lead isotope characterization of currencies in Central and Southern Africa. What these scholars did, they took these artifacts and they tested them. They tested their chemical makeup. And you can tell from the chemical makeup of these metals where they came from in Central Africa. Now, what this does, it lets us know that through the samples that they have, that Africans are getting these metals from very specific places and they're very far apart from each other. So the fact that they're all brought together to make these coins lets us know there was an extensive trade network, extensive communications across vast areas, meaning there had to be a centralized nation, the Luba Kingdom, that controlled all of this and were able to figure out how goods were going to be moved throughout the kingdom and create this centralized currency. So again, we don't need to wait to find some magic document that talks about everything that was going on in Africa. We can use modern science, archaeology, combine these things to have an understanding, a clearer picture of what was actually happening. Another thing I want to mention, a lot of these artifacts, like the stool you see here, the crocettes, other magnificent metalworking that was coming out of Central Africa, the wood carving and beadwork that was coming out of Central Africa, a lot of this are in museums, such as this one in Belgium. This is the Royal African Museum in Belgium. This was a museum that was founded in 1897 by Leopold of Belgium. We're going to talk about Leopold more in the next course, early history of the African Renaissance. King Leopold II of Belgium is one of the worst human beings to ever exist. And for African people, he is equivalent, if not greater equivalency to Adolf Hitler in terms of the amount of people that he killed or was responsible for killing in the Congo and the genocide that he unleashed in the Congo. And part of that genocide was also a cultural genocide by taking artifacts from kingdoms like the Luba Kingdom and the Lunda Kingdom and others and bringing them to Belgium, where they are to this day, here in this museum. If you go to Belgium, you see all the richness of Belgium, all of that can be traced to, much of it can be traced to African wealth, stolen African wealth. And we'll talk about the rape of the Congo in a while. But here's an interesting article that came out a couple of months ago. The Belgian government announced its decision to return Congolese artifacts. Now that sounds good till you actually read what's actually going on. So they're saying we're going to return some of these things because we think that some of this stuff in our collection was illegally gotten. illegally purchased. So we're going to return some of it. But you have to read the entire article. Belgium estimates that it obtained only 883, less than 1% of the museum's extensive collection of 85,000 Congolese objects illegally. So they're saying, we're going to admit, all right, 883 of these, we got those illegally. Now the rest, we're not so sure. So we're going to keep doing investigations to see if these things were taken illegally. So you see the slick game that they're playing. 883, that sounds like a lot. You realize they have 85,000 artifacts. So they're admitting these ones might be illegal, but the rest, well, we need further investigation. No, it's all illegal and illegitimate. It needs to be returned to Africa. But they're still playing around because they make tremendous amount of money from tourists coming into seeing African art, seeing African artifacts. And Belgium, until recently, hasn't reckoned with its colonial past and has made apologies. And even parts of this museum before it was renovated, and some visitors say even to this day, it makes it appear as though Belgium actually did something good for Africa. Like you would go into the museum and you would see a statue of a Belgian missionary bringing an African out of darkness. Those types of motifs were present in this museum. And there wasn't a lot of talk of what Leopold and his agents did in the Congo in the late 19th century. There was no talk of it. It was just look at the majesty of Belgium and what we took from Africa and how we brought these people out of savagery, so on and so forth. Interesting, this whole conversation of African artifacts being returned is getting a lot more attention recently in Europe and even in the Toronto Film Festival. I don't know if she won in the Toronto Film Festival, but she definitely won in one of the big European film festivals. There's a documentary that was released this year called Dahomey by Mati Diop. Mati Diop is a half French, half Senegalese director, artist, filmmaker, and she did this documentary and actually won the Golden Bear Award in the, I think, Berlin Film Festival. And you see her being presented with Lupita Nyong'o, who was there on the panel. And she won this award. It's the best documentary of the year. And it's going around the world. So if you can get it online and catch it and watch it, it's worth a look. But it tells the story of of artifacts, not just in Central Africa, but also West Africa, that are in museums all over the world that need to be returned. And we as African people need to have a clear position on that. So as I go back, the Luba Kingdom emerged. You know, we have kings, we have queens, we have a situation where as the empire expanded, just like we've talked about in previous classes, you start having succession problems. After the king dies, there's a number of male royal figures that are able to take the throne. And because of that, you have a lot of fighting among the royal classes. When this happens, two things occur. One, civil war that we've talked about in previous classes, which are detrimental to nation development. But then number two, in this case, which is a little bit different than the other places that we've talked about, some people just left and established their own kingdom. So when we look at the history of this region, the Lunda Kingdom, other kingdoms in the region, they talk about their first dynasties coming from the Luba Kingdom. That's part of their oral history. Oh yeah, our first rulers, they came from Luba. And they migrated from Luba because they were a civil war, they were unsatisfied with something, and they came and brought the technology of iron technology and new hunting techniques, and they brought those to our region, and then we grew. A lot of this information, this oral history, are recorded by a particular group called the Ba Mbudie. The Ba Mbudie. The Ba Mbudie were a secret society of historians, of record keepers, who were initiated and trained in the history of the kingdom. And they were able to recount these wars and these successions and who succeeded who and what king came from what village and what they did during their reign. And it was all in their memory. And they were able to maintain this history for centuries. That way in the 1960s, when most people say the last initiates of this society were still around, anthropologists, historians were able to come to them and reconstruct the history of the Loba Kingdom in conjunction with the archaeology and the written history, because eventually they come in contact with the Portuguese. And the Portuguese write about the kingdom, write about who was the king. They also, unfortunately, get touched by the slave trade on both sides. if you look at where Luba Kingdom is, there was also a slave trade that was coming across East Africa that was initiated by the Arabs. And then on the western part, they get in contact with the slave trade initiated by the Portuguese. So Luba is right in the middle. So by the time we get to the 18th century, the 1700s, Luba is getting it from both sides. And then into the 19th century, Luba is getting it definitely more so from the eastern side by the Arab-initiated slave trade. So we get that information coupled with the oral history. I'm going to focus on oral history before we take our break, because the Ba and Mbudye, they were able to keep this history alive through their initiation process, to bringing people in. And their job was also to check the power of the king. Because they held the historical record and they knew who succeeded who and what was going on, they were very important power players in the kingdom. They would tell someone, you're legitimate, you could possibly be royal, or you're not legitimate, you can't be royal. And that made it so that people stood in line. And they also had a spiritual element as well. So when the king wasn't doing right, wasn't incorporating the spirituality in a way that was providing abundance for the people, they would be checked by the bottom. They say, hey, you need to do what you need to do. You need to follow the example of so-and-so ancestor. And let me tell you the story of what it is that they did and how they were able to accomplish things. You need to live up to that, or else you will be removed. And then we will place someone else in your stead. So very important group. And they were called the men of memory, although there were also women involved in this group as well. It wasn't just restricted along gender lines. It was men and women involved in this secret society of history keepers. I want to talk about one of the most important tools that they used. They used something like this. And again, these are another one of these artifacts that are in museums all over the world that should be back in the Congo. These are memory boards. These are memory boards. So members of the Ba and Mbudye would use this board as a tactile device. And I could talk about it, but I would rather show you a video that talks about it in much more detail, to tell you about this ingenious African memory device that allowed for oral history to be transmuted easier. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you please pull up that video?
By modern standards, the Kingdom of Luba was an illiterate polity, but in the eyes of its inhabitants, there was a strong core of well-learned scholars who had their own system of recording history that in some ways was actually superior to writing. Instead of books, they used complex devices known as Lukasa memory boards. Usually composed of wood, these boards consist of numerous carved patterns, symbols, and designs, all the while inlaid with beads of various sizes and colors. These beads are arranged in several lines and patterns, all of which collectively contribute to the type of information that is conveyed. Each and every element of these boards represents a very specific event, attribute, or name, all coming together to record an entire piece of information. Lukasa boards are capable of recording the entire history of the kingdom and the genealogical records of the kings and title holders. They also record medical practices, territorial boundaries, and geographical landmarks of social, political, or religious importance within the kingdom. The board is read by holding it in the center with the left hand and dragging the fingers over top of it from the right hand. Yep, that's right, just like your phone. Its tactile properties are utilized as mnemonic devices to aid the historian in memorizing the information that he is trying to convey. These scholars who were learned in the art of Lukasa literacy were known as Mbudye and were taught to decipher the meanings of these complex memory devices in a manner not unlike learning to read or write. In addition to the Lukasa memory boards, other mnemonic devices were used to facilitate memory, including staves, stools, bow stands, and axes. Additionally, throughout the kingdom, there were site-specific wall murals and earthen thrones built in lodges for the Mbudye to conduct their rituals and activities. Finally, in addition to all of the devices mentioned, dances were also incorporated as a method of reciting historical narratives, cultural ideologies, and remembrance of kinship origins. However, the Lukasa devices themselves were the most important of these, as they served as a visual and tactile device created as a unique and permanent record in a manner not unlike that of the written word. The tactile nature of the various patterns and textures functioned in a manner comparable to pressing specific button combinations on a controller or keyboard, or somewhat similar to the modern-day system of Braille used by the visually impaired. Specific attributes of the Lukasa memory boards would be learned and known by the Mbudye in a similar manner in which they could be associated with very specific words, events, and titles, or numerous other informational facets, just as one, for example, can feel the R trigger button on a remote controller, and know just by how it feels and where it's located that it is how they fire their weapon in a video game. This would then be combined with other objects with different meanings all laid out in specific series and patterns until they were combined into a full set of data that could be learned, known, and memorized by all members of the Mbudye society. Or like memorizing that button combination for your favorite fatality in Mortal Kombat and remembering exactly which character it's associated with and what happens when you complete it. Facilitated by the Lukasa memory boards, the Mbudye's purpose within the Kingdom of Luba was to safeguard all political information and legitimacy and serve as a form of checks and balances to maintain the order of power and influence of the Luba elite in a manner that also remained discreet, effectively passing on important information all the while restricting it to a need-to-know basis. The kings of Luba exerted more power and influence than the Mbudye, but if he abused his power, the Mbudye society was more than capable of dethroning him. Mbudye is inextricably linked to kinship, and by some accounts, it is as old as kingship itself. In fact, any king that failed to undergo investiture rites with the Mbudye was deemed illegitimate. In conclusion, the Mbudye society of the Luba kingdom had their own analogous version of books or manuscripts known as Lukasa, which functioned as tactile and visual mnemonic devices to help historians retain information. Perhaps if we put more time and effort in modern times into studying the many alternative methods of record keeping from the African continent, with the same level of respect and attention to detail as we do with writing systems, we can learn, know, and understand more about the history, cultures, and traditions of the people who inhabited this land of ancient and complex civilizations. In this day and age, we use pictures and videos as valid methods of recording history, even if there is no writing at all, as visual and tactile memory devices can provide us with stronger methods of retaining information than writing alone. Lukasa memory boards provided a similar method of remembering things in an illiterate society, in a manner just like you, as a viewer of this video, are currently learning and knowing new and accurate information without the need of reading a single written word.
So let's take a break, because when we come back, we're going to talk about the European initiated slave trade, because I wanted you to see this so you could see the development that African states and nations were, the trajectory that they were on before the onset of slavery and colonialism. And this is right in the heart of Central Africa. So we're seeing a nation in development. We're seeing the diversification. You're seeing people with specializations in terms of what they do. The craftsmen, the people that made these, the people that use these, the traders, the currency makers, the businessmen, the businesswomen, all of this was happening at the same time that Europe was developing as well. And at this point in the game, Europe and Africa are on similar trajectories in terms of their technological development, in terms of their social development. We're seeing this. We're about to get into the period where that starts to break down a little bit. And we'll talk about what happens with that and African resistance to it. So we'll talk about that after the break. So Daniel, are there any, and I forgot to bring my adapter for my computer for the television I usually use in here. So I'm really having a hard time seeing hands and things. So Daniel's really gonna have to be my eyes with this one. So Daniel, go ahead and call on whoever has their hand up.
Okay, Mr. Francis and then Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Dr. Ledbetter, I might be jumping the gun a little bit, but I would like to talk about the exploitation of the natural resources in Africa. At a recent African Unity conference, an African scholar was mentioning that France was extracting from Niger uranium and selling it at $200 US per kilogram, but was paying Niger $11 per kilogram. Another thing he mentioned was that Russia was stealing $13.4 billion of gold from Sudan. That is 223 tons of gold per month. Now there's a thrust towards electric vehicles. And those electric vehicles are powered by high-powered lithium-ion batteries. And guess where the lithium is coming from? We have places like Zimbabwe, Namibia, Ghana, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, and Ethiopia. Would you like to comment about the further exploitation of the natural resources of Africa by Western countries?
It's Western countries, but then we cannot neglect the role of selfish African elite in this process. We're going to talk about the beginnings of this today, actually. You say you're not jumping the gun. It's just kind of a continued, it's a continuum that really starts at this period, this combination of economic exploiters from the outside, collaborating with economic exploiters on the inside. And this is what has held us back for the past 500 years. So, yeah, we're going to talk about the African resource of labor being exploited and exported out of Africa at this time. But then toward the end of this class, we'll talk about the beginnings of the European thought changing and say, wait, we can just exploit African labor in Africa and then take the resources out instead of using African labor to develop resources in the Americas. And we're just seeing a continuation. Now Africa's nominally free. We have independence, but many of our leaders are saying, well, I'm only going to be alive for about 80 years. Let me go ahead and get into power, make these deals with France or Europe, or turn a blind eye to what these companies are doing, enrich my family, and then die. And then let the chaos just fall where it may. Because I don't care, because I know if I get sick, I'll get treated in New York or in China or in Russia somewhere, and my children will be educated at the best schools around the world and all that. So that dual combination of the elite inside of Africa, certain elites inside of Africa, and the economic exploiters outside of Africa has been the #1 enemy of African working people. And it goes back to this time period that we're going to see and how this begins. So thank you for reminding us of that. And before the class is over, I do want to give an update on Haiti as well, because there's a lot of things that have happened in the past week that connect to what we talked about in our Haitian course. So before class is over, we'll get into that conversation as well. Thank you for bringing that up, Mr. Francis.
Thank you.
Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Morning, all. We started out this morning talking about liberation. Liberation and emancipation go hand in hand. After liberation and emancipation, the laws are still there. And when we don't have to bow down to the laws, we're taxed out of existence. So my question then becomes, when are we ever liberated or emancipated?
Yeah, I mean, and I can think the question is always the we. The we is the important part of that. When are we liberated? Because different people think about the we differently. For some people, the we is just the elite. The elite during the emancipation processes or the independence processes in a lot of countries in Africa and the Caribbean, they wanted to be free from the supreme economic exploitation that they were under so that they can resume their role as the exploiter, or at least have a better standing in the chain of exploitation. So for them, independence was, let us get in on this game. You can't hold us back the same way you hold back the working class Africans. But for many of us, independence meant a freedom for the working class folks against all these various forms of exploitation. But what was achieved was the former, a freedom of the elite to put up a new flag, have a new national anthem, and then get in on the exploitation of the African working masses. That has been the issue. So if you look at liberation from the perspective of the masses of population, we're still not free and we're still fighting for independence. If you're looking from the perspective of an elite, then they've achieved independence because they're able to join hand in hand, if not in a sometimes in a junior position, sometimes they're even in the senior position of the exploitative relationship alongside their European or Asian or Arab counterparts. So yeah, it's all about from whose perspective we're thinking about independence. And that's always something for us to consider. Because again, most of us on this call are working class people. Most of us on this call don't own 5 or 6 homes. Most of us on this call aren't big time people. And, you know, many of us, some of us might want to become those folks that engage. I hope you don't. I hope these classes are showing you that that's not the best place to be in terms of the historical record. Like you might work out for you during your lifetime, but how will you be remembered? Because the working class folks will win. So how will you be remembered? But anyway, most of us aren't of that class. So we have to continue to fight for that true emancipation that you were talking about. Robin, go ahead. And then Daniel, while he's talking, let me know if there's anything in the chat or there's any other hands up. Oh, Prince, is that you? Prince. Okay, so Robin and Prince.
So as always, a few comments and then a couple questions. But the boy, things are complex and yeah. So you in terms of the elites, right? We spoke last week about Jamaica, right? So the same thing happened there, right? The elites working with the exploiters, right? So, and here's a very personal story about how complex this is. I think I might have mentioned this, but so my dad, who is from Antigua, my mom from Trinidad, I was born in Halifax. They went to Halifax and did what a lot of West Indians did, go there, get your kids educated, but they wanted to get back to the Caribbean. So my dad, the way he got back to the Caribbean was he got a job with Alcan, the aluminum company in Jamaica, working as a doctor at their factory, right? Did that for 5 years. While he was with Alcan, Alcan paid for all my schooling and the whole bit. They flew me back to Jamaica twice a year, right? So I have directly benefited from the exploitation of Jamaica. And then my dad worked with Alcan for 5 years. Then he left and started private practice. My mother worked the whole time, like working with development agencies. So this is how complex it gets to, right? So, and now look at what I've ended up doing. So Alcan is partly responsible for unleashing me on the world, which is it's a good thing. Another comment. So I think it's always great. I mentioned that I attend Adrian Harewood's class on race, journalism, and diversity, right? So the class this week was on power, media, and the production of history. And one of the readings was Edward Said's book, Orientalism, right? Which is about like a really important text on just looking at how the West looks at the Orient, right, and in a derogatory fashion, basically with the same thing they did to Africans, right? With the idea, the main idea is to dehumanize them so you can steal their shit, right? And so what was interesting was I was reading about Said, and in his book, he makes reference to Joseph Conrad, right? The guy who wrote Heart of Darkness, which is about the Congo, right. So it's like, oh, look at it. One of the comments, those memory boards look like computer motherboards in the picture, which is kind of interesting. Okay, 2 questions are: what did the people expect from the king in return for their tribute? And is there? I'm assuming there isn't, but is there any record in the historical record, any record of memory loss, like Alzheimer's? Like, I'm assuming not, right? That's a new thing, because that would have been a bit of a problem back then. But
I'll answer the later first. I'm not sure, but there were so many people that were trained in it. Well, not so many people, but it was a society of folks. So even if one person lost their memory, it'd be passed on to other people. So it's a whole class of individuals that are tasked with this knowledge and remembering this knowledge and being initiated to learn it. And it's a long initiation process from what I've been able to read about. It's not like a week seminar that you just go to. It's like years of training, and it costs money. I mean, this was an industry even within itself, because it's kind of like, and I'm not trying to offend anybody's religion, so if you're a Scientologist, it's kind of like Scientology. If you know anything about that religion, people have to give money to get to the next level of information, and you get these trainings and you get to the next level. It's kind of like that. So there was a class element among the Ba and Moutier as well. Because you had to get money to get more training, and the more training you got, the more power you got because you knew more information, and then you could raise higher up. And you're the type of people that would challenge the king to say, you're not doing what you were supposed to do. Now, going back to the former question, what did the people expect? The king was not only a political position, it was a spiritual position. So the king was supposed to be the representative of the collective ancestors of these people on earth. And because you are special, we're going to treat you special. You're not going to eat in front of people. You're going to have special privileges other people don't have. We're going to give you tribute. You need to keep order in the society. So we shouldn't have any droughts. We shouldn't have any pest problem, locusts and things like that. We shouldn't have invaders from the outside because you should be able to control and bring up the military, and we should be able to defeat anybody that comes to fight us. If there's problem among villages, you need to have the know-how to adjudicate that. And you need to be able to make sure the business and the trade networks keep flowing. So that's your responsibility. Now, if you aren't good at that, if we're having these types of, like, I mean, not to say that a person has the power to control drought, but you're supposed to. I mean, we're giving you this tribute, so you're supposed. So if natural disasters start happening, if you overstep and you start demanding more and more tribute, and you're just accumulating, and you're not redistributing, particularly if you're not redistributing, because remember, there's a chain. There's the king, and then there's these sub kings for on the regional level that expect. I'm collecting the tribute for you, making sure everybody pays it. You need to trickle that stuff down to me. And then when I come to visit you at the capital, I want to be wined and dined. That's one of the things the king had to do. If people came to the capital, they were fed the best food, all the stuff that's coming in, you're supposed to get a cut. So if those things aren't being reciprocated and people feel like there's chaos, then we're going to start questioning the king. And then other royals would take advantage of this, particularly when the king died. That's when the succession battle happened. So once somebody gets established as the king, it's almost like you get tenure at university. Unless something crazy happens, or you just start being completely dictatorial and completely totalitarian, then you'll be removed. But if you just were a semi-exploiter, you got to stay. And then when you died, that's when the office opened up. So that's when all these sons and people in the royal family are brothers, nephews, all these people are vying for the throne. And then they're relying on their military and the hunting societies and the iron workers and the market women and the queens and all these people that they can muster together. And then the Ba and Moutier are looking to say, okay, who's the best contender and who's, and some of those people were members of the Ba and Moutier. So you had all these forces in play about how we're going to decide who's the next king. And sometimes I break into warfare. And oftentimes, some people would say, well, I lost and my brother became the king. So me and my supporters, we're out. We're going to leave and set up. And this is what happened. This is how other kingdoms in the Southeast and the Southwest and even parts of the North got established. Parts of the royal family and their supporters would leave because they couldn't take the tension. And they would either set up in a place that was less densely populated. They bring their new tools, their new ideology, and they would remember their own history, and they would have their own secret societies of history workers. And that's how we know that these empires were connected, because they would say in their histories, yes, we came from Luba. There was a problem, we came here, and then we took over here, and we established ourselves here, and then we started this kingdom, and so now my descendants can have it, and then the process would start over again. Once it got big enough that people start getting tight, then people will move and set up different places. So it's interesting when you had that, so there's not these crazy wars, like what was going on in Europe. At the time in Europe, same time period, 1600s, 1700s, you're having these religious wars in Europe. This is the time of the Protestant Reformation. So you got places like Germany and France and even England's involved in that whole region of Europe, where there's nowhere else to go. Like there is somewhere else to go. They start going to the Americas. If there wasn't for the Americas, Europe probably would have destroyed itself. I mean, they were fighting each other in holy wars because the Catholics saw the Protestants as being the Antichrist, and the Protestants saw the Catholics as being the Antichrist. So these were vicious wars. And then, of course, elites are taking advantage of all this. In Europe, I'm talking about, among the German principalities and the Italian principalities and all these little places in Europe, and they're fighting amongst each other, and hundreds of thousands of people are being killed. So all this is happening at the same time, but in this part of Africa, at least, people had the option of, all right, we don't like what the king's doing, so, or we don't like who just was made king, so we'll move out and do those things. So yeah, that's kind of the relationship between the king and the everyday people and the folks in the middle. So kind of, yeah, had that. Prince, go ahead.
I was just curious about the two things, the memory of men and women. In order to attain some of those positions, you mentioned that there was an element of class, but could anyone actually move into that position?
Join could be initiated. You probably had to have at least some type. You probably was. I would guess, based off of what I know about these societies, there probably was some type of initiation fee to join, and you paid the fee and you went through the process. Now, I would assume anybody would be able to do that if you could pay the fee and you showed some aptitude for it. So if you were a farmer or you were a metal worker, if you were a fisher and you accumulated enough of those copper sensitive currency to be able to get initiated, and you would get initiated. It's just like, I'm trying to think of a modern equivalency. It's like if you all know anything about the fraternal sorority organizations in Black America, those things cost money to join. People don't know that often, but when you're an undergraduate and you want to join Alpha Phi Alpha or Omega Psi Phi or any of the other ones, there's a fee that you have to pay. And I think it's more expensive now because back in the day, they used to be able to pledge people out in the open. If you all seen that movie School Days and how people went through initiation processes, but now that stuff is banned, quote unquote, on college campuses. So you have to pay a little bit more because there's insurance involved in case they paddle you on your butt too much. You have to go to the hospital. But there's all types of things you have to pay to get in. And then when you pay to get in, you have to continue paying your dues in those organizations, and then you get higher through your service. But I think, based off class, someone in those organizations, you can correct me if I'm wrong, what you donate to the organization allows you to get higher up. Same thing here. So you have to start out by giving a little bit for your initiation. You get in and you show your aptitude, and then you learn more based off of more money that you pay to get up into the higher echelons of knowledge, to learn, and learn more. And then you're trained and train more, then you keep that position. Mm.
Yeah, and then my second question was, it's called Lukasa boards. Yeah. So around the boards themselves, like what I thought was interesting was the physical representation of the stories and how they can be retained over time, because like in the digital age that we have now, a lot of information is just lost, depending on who's holding on to it. But with the representation of the story, is that something that if you understood how to interpret it, like anyone can just pick up a Lukasa board and understand the story, or was there context around it that was just passed on?
There's context, but anybody can't pick it up because most people wouldn't know wouldn't know what to do. It'd be like if I picked up like the example of Robert, if I picked up a motherboard, I wouldn't know I wouldn't know where to plug it. I wouldn't know what to do with it. So someone could pick it up, but they wouldn't know how to read it. They wouldn't know. You had to be trained in it. But even with that, there's still an element of improvisation, because you're not just, when you're presenting this story. So if the king came to your village and you needed to present the lineage of this king and his position in the kingdom and his ancestors and all that, you're not just saying it flatly, like you're reading the thing and just saying it flatly. You got to put something in. There's a performance element to it. There's dance, even as history as well, involved in it too. So there's a lot of things, a lot of room for improvisation for the particular person that is giving the history. Now, you're not going to improvise, succession and that type of thing, but how you present information or how you present episodes in history of battles or negotiation things, then it allows itself for improvisation. You see that even in other parts of West Africa. The story's not always told in the same way, depending on who's telling it and the audience that's involved. Because they'll look in the audience and they'll notice that somebody came from some other region. So in this telling of the story this day, that region might get a little bit more prominence just because of who's in the audience. So you have those type, the major story is not going to change, but we'll give this person a little bit more shine. It'd be like if somebody was telling the tale of, I don't know, the history of the Los Angeles Lakers, and they saw that Rick Fox's son was in the audience. They might give Rick
Good morning,
Fox
sir.
Good morning, my brother. How are you?
I'm quite well, and you?
You're not on mute, Mr. Francis. Daniel, somebody mute. If someone was telling the history of the Lakers and they saw Rick Fox's son in the audience, they might give him a little bit more prominent of a role in the Lakers dynasty than what he normally would have had. But it wouldn't change the fact that Kobe and Shaq were the main people on the team and Phil Jackson coached and all that type of stuff. All right. So, yeah, very interesting. And again, this is something that I didn't know about until I started preparing for this course. I didn't know about this. And there's so much in African history that we have to keep rediscovering and discovering and teaching out, because who knows if we had kept the knowledge of how to use these things and we spread it throughout Africa, where our knowledge of African history would have been. You know, so often our kids come into schools and they're learning history and they have to sit with a textbook, and we've known for years that people learn differently. Not everybody can learn from being lectured to and then responding to the lecture. Some students need tactical things to do with their hands. Some students need different ways to learn. Imagine how far along we would be as students if we had this as a tool in our high schools or in our universities, and we knew how to use it and we could use it for other areas of African history and memorization. Just little things like that. And when we talk about colonization and slavery, it's not just the loss of political independence or being put into a situation of economic dependence. It's the loss of cultural elements like this that we can't replace. You can replace money. You can regain political independence. It is hard to get back this invaluable cultural knowledge and expertise that we lose as a result of slavery and colonization. But we can reclaim it. We just have to do the work. We just have to put in the work. So let's talk about how this started. This development in Africa is happening. It's moving along. It's moving along the same rate as development in Asia and the Americas and in Europe. And states are rising, states are falling. We have this, back and forth in development, and things are moving along. And then enslavement comes, and then enslavement starts to creep its way into Africa. And then we've talked about this in previous weeks, but some things we'll go over again, and we've talked about in previous classes. But it's important to continue to talk about it. So the Portuguese, as we've mentioned for the past couple of weeks, they were the first Western Europeans to break out and start exploring the Atlantic in modern times. The Romans had done it, the Phoenicians had done it, other folks had done it, but in the modern era. So the Portuguese start making their way down the coast of West Africa. We talked about in 1447, the Navy in Senegal fighting against the Portuguese who were kidnapping people, but that doesn't stop them. They're making their way, and eventually they make their way all the way across Africa. At the same time, about 50 years later, the Spanish financed the voyage of Columbus. Columbus makes it to the Caribbean and starts the colonization process in the Americas. As this process is unfolding, Africans are there every step of the way. Africans are on the voyages of Columbus because the Portuguese had started the slave trade first, not to the Americas because they weren't in the Americas yet, but to islands in Northwest Africa to grow sugarcane. And then eventually the Portuguese took Africans to mainland Europe for domestic labor and also plantation labor in the Mediterranean, where sugarcane is being grown. Many of those Africans are also put into service in Spain. So the Spanish have Africans, the Portuguese have Africans, and those Africans are called Ladinos. These are Africans that were enslaved in Africa, but then brought up in the Spanish-speaking world and the Portuguese-speaking world. And then they would also have children. These children would be Ladinos. They are Africans that speak Spanish. So Ladinos were present on the voyages of Columbus. Ladinos were present in the entourage of Cortez in Mexico when he conquers the Mexica, called the Aztecs by the Spanish. So Africans are here in all of these processes, but in large numbers, this starts to happen at the turn of the 16th century, the beginning of the 1500s, when the Europeans realized that the indigenous population in the Americas are incredibly susceptible to European diseases because the contact between those two groups hasn't been major contact in hundreds of thousands of years. So they didn't have any immunity to European diseases the way Africans and Arabs and other folks that had been in contact did. So the indigenous population is dying. They also have the support of humanitarians such as Bartholomew de las Casas, the Spanish priest that says, yeah, it's not right to enslave indigenous people. Maybe we should do Africans because we've been enslaving Africans anyway at this point for about 50 years. Later on in his life, he would actually go on to recant that statement, but the damage had already been done. The Europeans said, yeah, that makes sense. Let's bring in the Africans since we already started this process. Many of them are heathen or Muslims anyway. That's the thinking. So we can enslave them. It's right to do so. So the Portuguese are the ones that start this off, and they're the ones that are most present in Africa in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, particularly on the coast. They haven't penetrated into the interior as of yet. And the reason why it's the Portuguese, we've talked about this in the past, the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope said, all right, Spain, you get everything to the west of this line. Portugal, you get everything to the east of this line. You're responsible for subjugating the heathens, either bringing them to Christianity or putting them in slavery or taking over their lands. But we're giving you the Christian duty to do that. So Portugal, you get this. Spain, you get that. Pope drew this line. So because Portugal was given Africa, that's why the Portuguese were the ones that established the first elements of the slave trade in Africa. And then bringing enslaved Africans to Brazil, which they controlled, and also providing the enslaved labor for the Spanish that are colonizing the rest of the Americas at the time. Now, again, the Dutch, the English, the French, they're all going to make their way to the New World because forget the Pope, particularly after the Protestant Reformation, then they really don't care what the Pope has to say. So this is the world that we have. Now, at this time, again, Africa is going through its own state building process. We saw the Songhai Empire emerge and fall. The Kingdom of Ashanti in 1700 rises and begins to spread. The Kingdom of Dahomey, Benin, Congo, Angola, or Ndongo, Luba Kingdom. All of these kingdoms are developing and they're rising, they're falling, they're growing. We're seeing more specialization. We're seeing technological advancement. And then the Portuguese come. Walter Rodney, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, really breaks down this time period. If there is a book that I would recommend anyone read, and this book was published in 1974, Walter Rodney is one of the greatest historians the African world has ever produced. And his work is so thoroughly researched that even as decades have passed, there's not much that you need to add to this book. Some of the figures may have changed slightly, but he did incredible research to write this textbook. Originally from Guyana, died in Guyana, killed by particular elites. Another discussion for another time, but he was a people's historian. We've talked about Rodney before. This book is a classic. So if you get your hands on it, it's relatively cheap. Read it, understand how Europe underdeveloped Africa, slavery and colonialism. But he says, these are the impacts of slavery on Africa. Depopulation, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people were taken from Africa or involved in the slave trade in some way. Because you have to remember, not everyone that was captured made it to the Americas. Oftentimes, and when Africans were taken, it was a result of wars that were happening in Africa. So those captives would be taken to the coast. Now, that's not just a half day's journey in some days, it's hundreds of miles to the coast, from the interior to the coast. So many Africans died just on those marches. Then when you get to the coast, you have the slave dungeons, and they didn't just leave every day. So you might be in a slave dungeon for months before they had enough Africans to fill up a ship and then take you. So a lot of people died in those dungeons. People died along the whole process resisting the entire way. So you have people that died in there. Of course, on the ships, you had a mortality rate of sometimes half the people on the ships. At least 1/3 of the people died on the ships. And then you get the actual people that made it to the Americas. So with all of that, you have a population loss of somewhere between 50 and 100 million people in a time period of a very short amount of time period historically, for about 400 years. So the early 1500s to the late 19th century, late 1800s. This is the time period that we're talking about. And we're only talking about the Western one right now. We're going to talk about the East African and the Arab initiated East African trade. We've talked about it a little bit. We'll talk about it more next week. Folks, of this 50, 100 million people, most of them were youth. People in their teenage years and in their 20s. The Europeans weren't interested in taking middle-aged people into slavery. They wouldn't make it. And they needed to exploit the best possible physical specimens for their labor. So you had men and women at the prime of their lives that could have contributed to their kingdoms, contributed to their communities that weren't kingdoms, that were more horizontally oriented politically and economically. And these people weren't just bodies to carry wood or chop down sugarcane or do these mundane activities. They were skilled personnel. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the Danish, the English, they were very clear in the types of skills that they were looking for. It's really disheartening when you see these curriculum battles in the United States that are happening right now. Because one of the things conservative elements in the United States are trying to say as they're fighting against African history or Black history being taught in schools, they say, when we write these textbooks, we want to make it sure that it's noted that African people got skills out of slavery. It wasn't all that bad because they got skills. It's almost like an unpaid internship. That's really how it's presented in some of these textbooks in some of these states in the United States. Without understanding, Africans came into enslavement with skills. They weren't just bodies to be implanted, knowledge to be implanted on them by Europeans. They were blacksmiths. They were scientists. They were market people. They knew business. They knew military. They had mining, iron mining, gold mining. They had mining skills. They knew how to do these things. They were doctors. They were judges. These were skilled personnel folk, historians, as we just saw. These were the type of people that were taken, religious specialists. These were the type of people that were taken into enslavement. It negatively affected African economic activity. As we mentioned last week, the trade that was going on, like we talked about today, the copper trade that was happening, the gold and salt trade that was happening throughout Africa, areas that the Europeans came into in West and Central Africa, the trade gets diverted from intra-African trade to trade with the Europeans. They're able to work with the elite who become voracious for European goods and things that are coming out of the Americas, that instead of trading with their African neighbors, they begin trading directly with the Europeans and then going to war with their African neighbors. Warfare is not good for economic development, particularly long distance economic development. As a trader that's going from one end of Central Africa to the other, and I'm using the river networks and the highways and things that are controlled, if there's warfare going on, civil wars happening all over the place, I'm not going to feel safe to bring my goods from one end of the region to the other. It's bad for business. And it caused a negative impact on intra-African economic activity, an impact that we're still seeing today in 2024, where you have some states that do more trade with Western Europe and China than they do with their neighbor next door in Africa. And all types of trade barriers, even though Africa has recently opened the free trade agreement in Africa. That's something the African Union has done. I'm not sure the implementation status of that, but that's a recent phenomenon as of the 2020s. This is something that we're still reckoning with. Again, that three is connected before, created this atmosphere of insecurity. People didn't feel confident anymore to engage with each other in that way because of all the civil wars, because of the wars initiated by the Europeans who were in search of captives. It's not like African people just had captives just laying around that they could just give to the European. The European initiated warfare. And again, in collaboration with certain African elites that wanted power, that wanted access to European goods, that wanted control of political positions. And then lastly, and most importantly, this led to the underdevelopment of Africa and the overdevelopment of Europe. It's the ultimate consequence of this slave trade. Africa was developing nicely, and then we started to see a steep decline in African development, and then Europe developed, making it easier when colonization comes around at the end of this process. Slavery and colonization are united. They are connected. You cannot talk about one without talking about the other, because one directly goes into the other. Slavery leads to colonization. Europe is able to get into the interior by the time we get to the middle and the end of the 19th century into the 20th century as a result of the profits made from slavery and even using a slave trade as a pretext for colonization. So you start the process, you initiate the process, which we'll talk about today, and then you say, oh, no, slavery is bad and the slave trade is wrong. So we're going to use that. The people that we propped up, the Ashanti Empire, the Kingdom of Dahomey, the ones that we propped up to engage in this slave trade, yeah, we're deciding that that's not good for our business anymore. So we're going to use that as a reason to come in and attack you because you're continuing the slave trade. See how that works? It's really sick when you think about it. So these kingdoms are developing. Portugal's making their way. They're exporting folks. But in this process, Africans resist. And this is one of the major things. I don't like to talk about enslavement without talking about resistance. You have to. Because the people that were put on those boats, the people that were put into these conditions of captivity, they resisted. They resisted on ships, and then when they get to the Americas, they resist. One of the first examples of resistance, we've talked about this before, of course, the resistance of the Wolof and the Taino indigenous people on the plantation of Columbus's son Diego. And this is happening in what's now the Dominican Republic. These Africans get together with the indigenous people, they look around at their situation, they're like, hey, wait a minute, these Spanish, and particularly Columbus's son, he's exploiting both of us together. Let's resist. And they resist, they burn down the plantation, and then they form their own community in the mountains that now separate Haiti and the Dominican in the southern portion of that island. You got Sebastian Limbo, who came from Central Africa, and his Quilombo of 200 to 300 warriors. When you see that word Quilombo, that's a Central African word meaning war camp, means war camp. A small version of that is a Mukambo. So we see these words coming from Central Africa to make their way into the Americas. Because as these Africans resisted, and they're coming from all parts of Central Africa, different kingdoms, but they have a similar understanding of the situation of oppression, but also political establishment back home. So when they come to the Americas, they say, look, we survived this ship. So that makes us family. That was a very special bond among Africans, no matter where they came from on the continent. If you survived that trip together, you were Malungos, you were shipmates, and that was a bond that was incredibly special because most of the people that got on, or at least a third of the people that got on those ships didn't make it out. And even going west over the ocean was seen as almost a form of death and rebirth. You're put into the belly of this ship, it's dark, it's cramped, people are dying, there's bodily fluids everywhere, it's a horrible thing, and then you come out of that into this new era. The people that survived that with you, it's like going to war with people. You form these types of bonds. And then when they're able to break free in the Americas and form their own communities, they called them Mukambos, they called them Quilombos. These communities that fought for their own freedom. And they existed throughout the Caribbean and throughout South America and even in North America. Let me go fast a little bit. So yeah, this is where that Quilombo existed. And again, you see the collaboration between Africans and indigenous people. They both saw that they're being oppressed. They organized, they collaborated, and they worked to get freedom. This is something that we can learn in 2024. But I want to spend more time in Africa before we go back to the Americas and before we close out for the day, so that you can kind of see an example of how this process started. Because again, Africa at this point in the game, we're talking about the 1400s, 1500s, these kingdoms are not like so weak compared to Europe. They're almost like this. But it's because of the elite in Africa making particular decisions to hold on to their power, working with the European folks, that's eventually going to cause Africa to become weakened. So let's take the example of the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa. So this is a little bit west of the Luba Kingdom that we talked about earlier, on the coast. It had developed, it had a kingship, it had a spiritual system. Again, the specialization, there's economic diversity. It is a kingdom on par with Portugal at this time. They're, neck and neck. Afonso I, he's born Mavimba Nzinga. He's the son of King Nzinga Nkuwu of Congo. He's born in 1456. In 1491, a year before Columbus goes to the Americas, his father enters a diplomatic relationship with the Portuguese. The Portuguese come to the Kingdom of Congo. They're seeing what's going on. The Congo king sees the Portuguese. He sees these new outsiders, and he enters a diplomatic relationship. Why? Because Africans are xenophilic. We like foreigners. We like strangers. We treat people with hospitality. We're not xenophobic. We don't see people coming and say, get out of here. So the Portuguese come. His father says, all right, you seem to have some knowledge of science. You're able to, operate these ships and navigate the oceans. You might be valuable to me as a diplomatic partner. How do we seal this diplomatic relationship between us? The Portuguese tell him, well, look, we have this thing called Christianity. So if you want to be in business with us, we need you to get baptized, and this is what you need to do. King says, no problem. Cool. Just get in this water, and you're going to call me. What are you going to call me? Zhao? Oh, you can call me Zhao. Fine. Why not? John the First. Why not? My people will still call me Nzinga, but you can call me that. If this is what you people do for diplomatic relationships, cool. His father gets baptized, is given the name by the Portuguese Zhao the First. And you're already seeing elements of how the Europeans are approaching the colonial project later on. This idea that in order to subjugate Africans, one of the first things we need to do is to alienate them culturally. We got to change your name. Even though nowhere in the Bible does it say that you need to change your name to become a Christian. It doesn't say that anywhere in the text, but you needed a quote unquote Christian name, according to the Portuguese. So his father converts. But however, after a while, his father realizes what that really means, and that the Portuguese expect him to be like them. Most importantly, the Portuguese expect him to have only one wife. Now, as we've talked about with these African kingdoms, these kings would marry multiple women from different regions in their kingdom in order to, number one, form alliances, and number two, then you can have a number of children, and any of them could become the future king, and all the regions in your kingdom have an opportunity, possibly, to have someone that might actually be a ruler. So it's a diplomatic strategy in addition to being, he might actually love these women. I don't know, but there's a lot of them, so I don't know, and I won't get into his personal life. But anyway, he goes back to his ancestors' spirituality. I mean, he probably never left, but he makes it clear to the Portuguese that I'm not really going to be a Christian. This is his father, King Nzinga. So when his father dies, and the Portuguese are there, and one of the things while his father's going through this process, he gives his son, Movember, to the Portuguese to be educated. He sends his son, he said, look, I want you to learn everything that the Portuguese know. And a lot of the royal families sent their children to the Portuguese to get education. He said, learn from these people. Let's see what they know. The problem is, Mvimba really, I won't say it's a problem. I'm not going to put it as a problem, because if you convert to a new religion and you actually believe that religion and it makes your life better, good for you. He actually converts to Christianity. He listens to everything the missionaries say about Christ, about redemption, about all of that, and he is convinced. So he becomes a Christian, and a strong Christian. And the Portuguese see in him a good student. They see in him someone that could represent their interests. The problem is, Mvimba he's not the chosen one among the people to be the successor of his father. So when his father dies, Mvimba goes to the Portuguese and he says, look, I love Christ, and I love everything that you all have brought here so far. I want to become king. Can you help me out? The Portuguese say, sure, we'll help you out. We'll help you become king. But if we do that, we have to represent our interests. And part of that is you need to attack all of these elements of African spirituality. This is what the missionaries are telling them. They're like, look, your father, he turned his back. He was a backslider, as they used to say in the church. He was a backslider. He turned his back on Christianity. You're a true Christian. And in order to really save this kingdom, because you don't want to see your people go to hell, right? We need to destroy all these ancestral shrines, all these religious symbols. This is the devil. We got to destroy all that stuff. And he goes about it faithfully. The Portuguese back him. He takes the throne. Using Portuguese guns and Portuguese mercenaries, he becomes the king of Congo. And then he begins the process of destroying all the idols and destroying all the symbols of his ancestors. And the Portuguese write, because they're happy with this, they write back to the king in Portugal. They say, this guy, he destroys all their idols, and anybody that is found using them, he burns them, and he's doing good. So he had this relationship, him and the Portuguese. The Portuguese are also saying, you know, he didn't just get the throne peacefully. As I said, he had Portuguese guns and Portuguese mercenaries. So as he's defeating his brothers and becoming king, and those little wars that are happening, the Portuguese are saying, yeah, we got this project in this place called Brazil. So any captives that you get in your wars, why don't you go ahead and sell them to us? That'll help you get rid of enemies, and then it'll help us because we got this little thing in Brazil going on. So you sell us your captives. So he did. He did. And then as other wars were happening, as his kingdom was expanding, maybe they're fighting with neighbors, or he has to put down a rebellion in a certain region in his territory, those captives were given to the Portuguese, and they were taken to Brazil, or they were taken by the Portuguese and sold to the Spanish for development of Jamaica, for development of Mexico, for the development of Colombia, Venezuela, so on and so forth. Wow, this is all happening in the early 1500s. Eventually, though, him being a good Christian, him trying to be a good king, because he's not doing this again. He's not thinking he's doing this on behalf of the Portuguese. He's thinking he is being a good Christian monarch. He doesn't want to see his people go to hell and burn for eternity. That's what he was taught by the missionaries. So he's attacking the shrines to save the people. He has to fight these civil wars and win to be the king, because if one of his pagan brothers become king, everybody's going to hell. So he does that. He establishes himself as king. He's the regent. He's in charge. But then the Portuguese just keep asking for more and more captives. And he's not even fighting wars at this time. He's like, all my enemies are defeated. My opponents are defeated. There's no rebellions anywhere. We don't have any beef with our neighbors. Where do you want me to get these captives from? Could you please stop asking for captives? But that's all the Portuguese want. The Portuguese don't want anything else. They don't want any other gifts. They don't want to do any other business other than inhuman beings. And at the same time, again, there's all these other members of the royal family and these elites in various regions of his kingdom that also have relationships with the Portuguese. He's not the only one. And they want what the Portuguese are bringing in. They've taken a liking to European fashions and European drinks and European this, that, and the third. So you have these regional governors and other folks that are kidnapping people. In Congo, there was an form of enslavement and captivity. We've talked about this in various African places. But the Congo people themselves were not supposed to be made captives. If you were free, you weren't supposed to be put in captivity unless you lost a war or something like that. But the Portuguese are taking even free people. So Afonso writes a number of letters, and we have all of these letters. These letters have been historically maintained. You can read them, and he writes in perfect Portuguese because that's how he was taught. And he's writing to his brother, the Christian king of Portugal. They're supposed to be brothers in Christ. This is how he thinks. There's no inequality. There's no racism. We're brothers in Christ. I'm a king. You're a king. Here's what I need to say to you. He says, we cannot reckon how great the damage caused by the Portuguese merchants is, since the mentioned merchants are taking every day our natives, son of the land, and the sons of our noblemen and vassals and our relatives, because the thieves and men of bad conscience grab them, wishing to have the things and wares of this kingdom, which they are ambitious of. They grab them and get them to be sold. And so great, sir, is the corruption and licentiousness that our country is being completely depopulated. And your highness should not agree with this, nor accept it as in your service. And to avoid it, we need from your kingdom no more than some priests and a few people to teach in schools, and no other goods except wine and flour for the holy sacrament. So even in his appeal, he's trying to appeal spiritually. He said, look, we just need teachers and priests, and we don't have the type of wine and flour for the holy sacrament. So we need that from you. We don't need anything else. This is something that I had a professor in graduate school named Dr. Amma Mazama. She always used to talk about this. She said, this is the height of colonization, that you can't even practice the European Christianity in the African way. You need to import European wheat and European wine to do the communion. You can't even use African wine. She said, I guess the European Jesus can't digest African food. So that's what she used to say. I love Dr. Mazama was great. But anyway, so he said, this is why we beg of your highness to help us, to assist us in this matter, commanding your factors that they should not send here either merchants or wares, because it is our will that in these kingdoms there should not be any trade of slaves nor outlet for them. So this is the king. The Portuguese ignore this. They ignore this, and they continue the trade. And then after he is gone, it increases. It increases to the south when the Portuguese have to come in conflict with the kingdom of Ndongo. We talked about the great Queen Njinga and her fight against the Portuguese, and we won't get into that. But as all this is going on, it's the 1600s become the 1700s, the increase in Africans coming to the West continues. And all those problems that we mentioned continue in Africa, in West and Central Africa, in Northwest Africa, even in East Africa, which we'll talk more about next week. But as these Africans make their way into the Americas and they rebel, some of them stay on plantations, they stay in the mines, they stay under oppression. Many of them escape and they form their own communities, like the great Angola Jonga or Little Angola in Brazil, a free African nation that existed for about 100 years in Brazil. Thousands of people from Central Africa, from West Africa, even indigenous people, and even some Europeans that didn't want to be oppressed by the Europeans were in this kingdom. They had churches, because again, Christianity had been in this region of Central Africa for almost 200 years at this point. So you had Africans that were coming into enslavement that were already Catholic. So you had Christian churches, you had African religious institutions, all in this kingdom together. They created a political system that mirrored what was going on in Central Africa. You had a queen, you had a king, you had the king wasn't all powerful. It had, subdivisions. It had regions in Brazil. This is all happening in northeastern Brazil. The Portuguese called it the Republic of Palmeiras, but the Africans called it Angola Jonga, meaning Little Angola, because that's where many of them came from. Although there's Africans from other regions in this place. They created new spiritual traditions, new political traditions based off of what they had back home. They defended themselves by creating a military to fight against the Dutch and the Portuguese that came to conquer them. It's only through some treachery that they were actually defeated. But they weren't the only one. There were hundreds of these quilombos throughout Brazil. This is just the biggest one, but there were numerous ones. We can look at the Garifuna, who came out of Central Africa, who were lucky because their ship wrecked in the Caribbean. And then they were never enslaved, actually. And they were able to form their own communities in Nicaragua and Honduras. They started actually on an island and then they were transported to Honduras, where they live today. First they were taken to St. Vincent, shipwrecked, then they make their way into Central America, and they were able to maintain their own culture and collaborate with the indigenous population as well. And they were known as the Black Caribs. They had indigenous American elements as well as African elements. They speak pretty much an African language, and they were able to withstand slavery and attempts to re-enslave them for hundreds of years. And their descendants still exist. I think the largest Garifuna community is actually in New York. I think there's more Garifuna in New York than actually in Central America, but they continue to exist. In Mexico, you had a free African town, the free township of San Lorenzo de los Negros. At the same time that the Luba Kingdom is doing its thing in the 1600s and 1700s in Central Africa, you had a kingdom that was founded by an African from Gabon named Gaspar Yanga. Gaspar Yanga was actually royalty in Gabon, ends up in the slave trade, comes to Mexico, fights for his freedom, frees other people, and forms his own town that's able to defend itself. And the Spanish are forced to sign a treaty saying, all right, you're all free, you're all independent. Gaspar Yanga. I like the write-up of Gaspar Yanga by one of the Spanish that interacted with him. It says, Gaspar Yanga was a Negro with a gentle body of royal blood, and whom people said would have been king had he not been captured. With such elevated thoughts, he had been the first in the rebellion for 30 years. His authority and lovely manners toward those of his color were greatly wooed his people. He was very old, having reserved for himself the administration of civil and political matters, and he trusted the direction of troops to another Black from Angola, whose name was Francisco de la Matosa, the name of the owner whom he served. So you're seeing this African from Gabon, which is near Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon, and his Second in command is an African from Angola. So we're seeing Africans from West and Central Africa working together to create a new territory, a free township in Mexico. It's from this group of these folks from Central Africa and Mexico that we get a lot of things. One that I just learned about recently is a very famous rock song in the 1950s called La Bamba. La Bamba by Richie Valens. Richie Valens was a Mexican-American rock and roll singer. He died young. He was in this very famous plane crash with a bunch of other rock and roll people died, Buddy Holly and somebody else. It's called The Day the Music Died is when this plane died. But anyway, Richie Valens had a hit song called La Bamba. You probably heard of it. La, 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 la Bamba. La, la. La Bamba is that, the rhythm of that song and even the name of that song is coming out of Central Africa. Bamba, the Bamba people. There's a player in the NBA named Mo Bamba. He's a center. He's played for Orlando. I don't know where he plays for now. But Bamba comes out of Central Africa. So that song made its way from Africa into the Americas and then into rock and roll. So it's really interesting how these things go. And even the first Black president in the Americas wasn't Obama. It's actually 200 years before Obama. A man by the name of Vicente Guerrero was an Afro-Mexican. He was president of Mexico. He actually outlawed the slavery in Mexico. He abolished slavery in Mexico. And he was a Black man, or partially Black. But Vicente Guerrero comes from this population of Africans, of Afro-Mexicans, who still exists today. Still a large population of Afro-Mexicans. So we'll stop there today. There's a number of other African communities that we could talk about that existed. This African nation building continued. The Maroons in Jamaica and Colombia, of course, Haiti, which we've talked about in depth. So we'll stop there today. We'll open it up for questions and general discussions. And next week, we are moving to East Africa. So we're continuing our counterclockwise rotation throughout Africa. We're going to talk about East Africa next week. We're going to talk about East African trade, what was going on in the Swahili city-states. We will also talk about the Horn of Africa. We'll talk about relations between Ethiopia and Somalia at this time, the Kingdom of Ethiopia, and how it was almost conquered by Ahmed Gran, the great Somali general. We'll talk about the Oromo expansion as well and what that meant for the region. So a lot we'll go over next week. So we'll stop there for today and open it up for any questions, comments, or announcements.
So there was an update around.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. So if those of you who've been paying attention to the news, the quote-unquote gangs in Haiti have essentially taken over the capital. I don't like to use that word gangs because it's really difficult in the Haitian situation to actually separate gangs from the quote-unquote government. Because if a government is illegitimate, it's essentially a gang. And if the gangs have the legitimacy of the people, they might be the government. What makes the difference?
Like our police?
I wasn't gonna say it, but you get it. Go ahead. Exactly. It's just who legitimizes the people that have weapons. So essentially, people that aren't the police, and the reason why I hesitate to call them gangs, because gangs operate for economic gain and they're engaged in criminal activity. These folks are, many of them, particularly the vocal ones, are saying, we want political change. We don't want the prime minister to come back. The prime minister went to the United States to beg for support. He's illegitimate, by the way. Let's start off with that right off the bat. The prime minister is illegitimate. In fact, we know that not the prime minister, excuse me, the president of Haiti. The president was assassinated a couple of years ago. This guy is now the acting president. He's supposed to hold elections. He has not held elections. Even his own election to the position that he was in before presidency was tainted because only 20% of the people actually voted in this farce of an election. So the quote unquote government of Haiti that's requesting all this assistance is completely illegitimate. No one has voted in years. So this government is illegitimate. So let's start off with that. So the illegitimate president of Haiti was coming back from the United States, and armed protesters have attacked the airport in Haiti. And they're not letting him land. And now he's in Puerto Rico because his plane couldn't land. And one of the more vocal leaders of these armed protesters, who the international community are calling gangs, is saying, we will not stop. We're not putting down arms. Fighting will continue until the prime minister steps down. They've attacked police stations. They attacked one of the largest prisons in Haiti and let everybody out. Now, it's amazing how in Haiti, when this happens. Everyone is like, this is outrage. How could they let these people out? Murderers and all this, that, and the third. But yet, in France, every year, it's one of the biggest holidays, Bastille Day. The storming of the Bastille to let out prisoners. So let's be real about what's going on. Let's have a true understanding of this. And if you took the Haiti class with us a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this. So the U.S. has sent Marines into Haiti. They didn't make a big announcement about it. And the announcement that was made, I saw it in the Armed Forces newspaper, because the Armed Forces have their own media. And it's just, oh yeah, Marines have been sent to support U.S. assets and the embassy. So that's already has started. And now they're still trying to bring in these Kenyan troops, even though the Kenyan people have spoken pretty loudly and said, we don't want any parts of this. We don't want to be involved in this. So we're seeing the international community circle around. But the masses have spoken. I mean, they spoke years ago. We don't want this prime minister. They didn't want the president before, the one that got assassinated. Now, the masses didn't assassinate him. That was a battle among elites. But in this situation, we have to keep monitoring it, because you have a number of people that are armed. Some of them are actually the masses in arms. Masses that are fed up with the situation, fed up with the corruption, fed up with the elite, and they're taking arms and they're willing to support. So those people we should support as much as we can find out if that's who they actually are. Then there are other people that are actually supported by certain elites that are armed, that are also engaged in this chaos. And then you have people that are sent by the United States. What's the brother's name? I forgot. He just got out of jail in the United States. He was there. He used to be a politician in Haiti. Which one? Yeah. Philippe, I call him Philippe. I like to do it the Spanish way. Philippe, yeah. Got Philippe. He's there. Got out of American jail in Haiti. This is very similar to Charles Taylor. If you know what happened with Charles Taylor in West Africa, these people get out of American jails. Well, Charles Taylor, quote unquote, escaped from federal prison in the United States and made it back to Liberia. This man was actually legally extradited back to Haiti, even though he was supposed to serve out his sentence in the United States. Why would the United States extradite a man that's been charged with numerous murders and drug trafficking back into Haiti at a time of chaos like this? What sense does that make? But they did that. Why? Because they probably talked to him in his jail. And they said, look, you were anti-Aristide. You were part of the illegitimate government in Haiti in the post-2010 government. We think that we can work with you. Now, this whole drug trafficking thing, we don't want you trafficking drugs anymore, but we're going to set you up as the next possible ruler of Haiti. So we're going to send you back, go reestablish your position and where you were at, and I'm guessing, I'm speculating, I'll probably say, we'll give you some arms, we'll give you some amnesty. You go ahead and take over, because we can work with you. We don't know about these other people that are rising up. So don't be surprised if you see that man become the next leader of Haiti. I would not be surprised by that, or at least vying for that position. So this is what's going on. Keep monitoring it. Listen to the actual voices of folks that are in Haiti, that are telling folk, presenting what's going on. You have to kind of weed through the BS, because there's some groups that are in Haiti, but they're actually representative of the elites that just want this chaos to be over so they can get back to business as usual of exploiting working class people. So you have to look at multiple sources to kind of get an understanding of what's going on. Read the news, the Western news, follow social media, see what's actually going on with Haiti. Look for people that are actual experts on what's going on in Haiti, Haitians themselves, Haitian scholars that could tell you what's really going on, and keep monitoring the situation. We'll continue to have updates on it as we talk throughout our class. But if you haven't watched that, go back to our course website. You can watch the segments that we did on Haiti, the session that we did on Haiti. You can get a better understanding of how this fits into the history of that great nation that we should all support. So thank you. Thank you for reminding me about that, because I would have forgotten. We'll go to Mr. Francis, David H. Daniel, let me know if there's anything in the chat.